Here we go. Okay, Acharda, this is going to be my second video. A big, long discussion about pronunciation and pronunciation mistakes and explaining my reasons for having gripes across the board. Hopefully it won't be as long as the last video because that was pretty abysmal as well. But first what I want to talk about is pronunciation in language learning. Why it is so important, right? So the first thing I want to say is, obviously, if you think about it, if you think about a language, learning a language like learning an instrument, right? The first thing you learn when you learn an instrument is where all the keys are, or where all the strings are, what all the holes are called, what have you. You know, what sound each thing makes, where, why, when. And that, it sounds silly to say. Spoken languages use the mouth and the throat, right? And that's the tool you're using. If you were learning a sign language, the first thing you would learn would be what shapes are you going to make with your hands, right? And if you're learning a spoken language, the first thing you should learn are should be all of the sounds that are present in that language, right? And you should try and forget the sounds of your native language, because they're going to be different. Whether you like it or not, they're going to be different. And this is what happens with spoken languages, with babies, right? Obviously, if you have a baby, the first thing you do when, trying to get them to say words is you go, say ba ba ba, say ah, say ma ma ma, whatever. It's the first thing you do. But it's not what we do with students. That leads me on to my second point, which is, so coming from the fact that pronunciation of correct sounds in a language is the most important, is the most basic part of learning a language. If you didn't focus on pronunciation as your first step when learning a language, that leads to the area of pronunciation having the most bad habits for learners, right? So, yes, it's the most basic. It should be the thing that you learn first. But because it's the most basic, it's most susceptible to having bad habits. This is what gives entire countries stereotypical bad pronunciations or stereotypical accents when they're learning a language poorly, right? It's really common, but it's also really simple to just sit down and try and fix it. And that leads me to my third point, because it's the area of language learning that has the most bad habits. It's the area of language learning that people get the most offended about when you correct them or when you give them advice about. You can go years, if you don't know any better, you can go years pronouncing a language with the wrong sounds. And obviously, it's just a natural thing. Someone's going to try and correct you, and then as soon as they do, you're going to be offended. You're going to think that they're, saying something that they're not, that they're trying to make some sort of comment that they're not. And that shouldn't discourage you from trying to improve your language. Yes, maybe you have bad habits. Everybody's going to have some sort of bad habit. But once you sit down and you just recognize that it can be improved on, and that maybe you're just not right then you open the door to having 10 times better skills in whatever language you're learning, right? Like I'm learning German, right? I remember in first year of college, there was a guy who pronounced the German. So the German word for is ist, right? Ist, ist, and he thought, obviously, because there's so many other German words where st is pronounced st, as in stop. Do I know any other German words? But because he saw all of those words, Stuttgart, yeah, there's like a million of them. Anyway, because he saw all of those st words, he thought that st was always pronounced st. So he said, when he would say like the word that is good, he would say das ist gut. And there was a minute in class where we were just waiting to see what the exercises were going to be, whatever. And I spoke to him and I said, "Oh, this was after months of constantly listening to him saying isht," and I was like, "Oh, sorry, actually, st isn't always pronounced st. In this word, it's actually ist. You don't have to do that in the nicest way possible." And he looked at me and he shrugged and he literally said, "Oh, that's fine. I don't care." And I was just like, you're trying to learn this language. Hopefully you want to have the most accurate, speech possible in in everything about the language. And I'm trying to give you help and you just say that you don't care. And that amazed me. And what's going to happen? You're going to not care. 5 years time, you're going to go to Germany and all the German people are going to go, well, fucking Jesus, look at you can't speak German. Especially the German people. Anyway. And the same thing happens with Irish. Well, I wish it happened even more, because what we actually get is people not correcting pronunciation enough. People don't have the information. People don't know. It's not their fault, There's not enough resources out there to tell you what is the best pronunciation that you can have in speaking Irish. But I'm going to try. So, as I said in my last video, the treatment of Irish pronunciation reminds me of a lot of Americans, right, learning Spanish. And just as it happens, I came across an Instagram account. I'm not going to name the Instagram account, but I found it, and it's this woman learning Spanish, right, in America. And her pronunciation is literally an American accent. And it just, I mean, maybe in America they treat it differently, but like you can't do that when learning a language. You don't get to just decide that your language that your accent works in the other, in another language. And this is what happens in every other language except for Irish. In the comment section of this video, all native Spanish speakers were there saying it's so funny to listen to Americans trying to speak Spanish. People were saying it sounds like Simlish, which is important. I'll speak about that later. And now, Obviously, this isn't too bad because her pronunciation is improving. Has been over the last uh while. But we'll give it a listen, right? Hopefully, this doesn't sound terrible.
Un gatocito corriendo en mi jardín. Hola, gatocito. Hey, ¿a dónde vas? Mac, él está aquí.
Mac, ela está aquí. There's un gatocito in mi jardín. I actually think it might be a piss take. It might be a piss take, but that's what happens a lot with Spanish, with Americans learning Spanish. This is what happens 99% of the time with Irish people learning their own indigenous language, and that is just, do you know what I mean? Can't happen. It doesn't make sense. Um, and I'll talk about that even deeper later. So, what actually is the issue? What is the what's wrong with this? What happens when people pronounce Irish using English sounds? As I said just there, people think, now you might not say it out loud, but students believe that the language matters less. They believe that it's less real somewhere deep down in their brain. If the language isn't treated with proper care, if it's not, you know, accurately spoken, if, you know, if a proper shot isn't given to the pronunciation, to the words, to everything, students will take that poor treatment and they'll do it themselves, right? They'll think, oh well, you're clearly not even trying. It must not matter. Um, and then that also leads to people making jokes, like Simlish. People say all the time. Um, like if you speak Polish with an American accent, that sounds like Simlish, and people say Irish sounds like Simlish. It does if you're not using the correct sounds. Native Irish doesn't sound bad at all. Anyway, the second thing that happens is if you are using Irish with the, I'm sorry to say, I don't like to say it, making mistakes in your pronunciation, right? If you're making mistakes in your pronunciation, then you yourself, first of all, you're getting made fun of. That's terrible, and you yourself can't understand native speech because the difference in native speech and your pronunciation is so drastic that, you know, most of what you hear from the language is yourself, and you're going, oh, Konik me madra inye, um, Canig me mo brishta sashopa, like that's what you're saying, and then you'll turn on the radio for 1 second, and they'll all you hear, because you haven't paid attention to the native speech, is and that's another thing, because bad pronunciation gets normalized, good native speech also gets made fun of. It's just terrible. Um, and the third thing that happens is, as a learner, is you then collect a load of bad habits that, it's not the worst thing. You'd rather have a load of bad habits and fix them than get made fun of for, whatever. But it's just terrible. Um, that those bad habits will take a long time for you to fix. Long time, I say like a month. It's really not that bad. But this mentality in Ireland really, really shocks me, because I will try my best to use native pronunciation of Irish, and then people say, I've had it before. Like literally, I've spoken a sentence in Irish at a party or something, and people look at me and they say, "Why are you doing that? Why, why are you over pronouncing all the khs and ghs and rose and whatever?" And obviously I try to be nice, but if I really spoke my mind, what I would say would be, I'm not over pronouncing the language. You're under pronouncing the language. Yes, it's possible to under pronounce something. Anyway, so I don't have my I already gave an example just there of speaking Irish using English sounds. Like anything. Do I have a sentence that I can just whip out real quick? Maybe. Oh yeah, here we go. Here's a sentence just from this random grammar book. And if I speak it using English sounds only, it might not stand out to you instantly that the pronunciation is terrible. You might think actually it's quite good. Tá sé ein céim leis an ullmh sa bhéid go bhfuil sé ina duine léinte. That's basically how it goes. Or I'll keep going. Níl ein agla orm rive fod atá mo fistal ishka lum. Get me? Page 303, just so I don't forget when I'm writing that on the screen. But you might think that's not so terrible. Then, on the other hand, if I speak English using only Irish sounds, then it stands out to you. So, I'll try my best. It's difficult because I have to focus. If I speak English with only Irish sounds, then you can see that the languages are so different. You get me? I can't even do it because they're just so different, and you can't replace one with the other. That's my point. So the point that you can't replace one sound system with the other is the same reason, right, that you can't spell Irish using English sounds. Now, I just scrolled through Instagram there for a second, and I made a small list of the accounts I found that it actually boils my blood when I see this. And everybody does it, and I don't blame them, but it doesn't work. The accounts or the teachers that use English spelling to explain Irish pronunciation, right? So I found these. Not that their content is bad all the time, right? Sometimes it's actually quite good, but this literally needs to be banned because it is misleading. So SNA Gaeilge, Seachtain na Gaeilge Instagram account. Half of their posts maybe have this, and I have some examples written down to show you what I'm talking about. It's terrible. Bite Size Irish. They've been mentioned as offenders before, and apparently they don't want to change their mistakes, so we'll leave them in the dust. They're on their website all the time. you'll have an Irish word or an Irish sentence, and then underneath in brackets you have this. I mean, it just it looks terrible as well, and you can tell when you read this, you know, poorly explained breaking down of Irish into English spelling, like that it doesn't look right. Anyway, they do it on their website all the time. And then also, I just found this Instagram account, and what's so bad is some of these lessons are really, really good, really, really helpful, slow explanation of grammar or vocabulary, what have you. But there's problems with this. So anyway, another account that I found, which probably does it in every post, is Gaeilge Savile. They have an Instagram account, and literally every post I saw, serial offenders, and it's terrible. So here's an example of what I'm talking about. I have 4 words here, 4 Irish words, and then in quotation marks how you might write the pronunciations with close English words. So, and I'm just gonna, I mean, if I pronounce them, it'll speak for itself how this doesn't work. So, bored, and then English pronunciation written underneath, bored, right? So people will pronounce this word as bored, the exact same as bored, when it literally isn't. Cael, very important word. Cael is the Irish word for slender, and people will pronounce it as the English word quail, and they will use the English word quail to explain the pronunciation, when that's just not it. Down as down. So even the most small differences still matter. And then, I don't even know if I want to say this, the single biggest mistake that is made when pronouncing Irish, unfortunately, is the name of the language itself. Gaeilge, pronounced as Gaelga. Now, I'm not gonna get angry on screen, but my one, note to end this section before I move on is 2 things. One, the sounds gwa and qua exist in English. They do not exist in Irish. It does not. It simply does not occur. And this letter, E, the letter E, will never, ever, ever, ever be pronounced as A. I will explain how to pronounce them properly in later videos, but G is never pronounced gwa, C is never pronounced qua, and E is never pronounced as A. So those are some pretty unfortunate offenders. I'm going to talk about other ones. So the problems with that is, obviously, it's not accurate. As I just demonstrated, it doesn't sound like how the words should sound. And what it also leads to is, it leads to people ignoring Irish spelling, as if Irish spelling isn't enough to explain its own pronunciation. Whereas, like if you make Irish lessons about vocabulary, about grammar, about whatever, and you just don't write anything else to explain the pronunciation except for the word itself, that's sufficient. Genuinely, Irish spelling is so consistent, and it really speaks for itself. It does the work by itself. I am not going to do that. I'm going to use pronunciation symbols in my videos just to be extra clear and to explain the pronunciation of different dialects, obviously. But this shit, which you'll see on the websites that I mentioned, has to stop. It's just not necessary. Anyway, other so like G and C being pronounced as gwa and qua, and E being pronounced as a. Other really, really common offenses that I see are CH being, or C shave if you're using a punk, being pronounced as k. Simply doesn't happen. Or, the letter or, everywhere, being pronounced with the English or, r. I'm going to make a whole video on how to pronounce or properly because, yeah, I get it. It's complicated. It is the most complicated letter probably. But, yeah, it's, that's poor. Basically all the vowels, especially long vowels, E fada, O fada, U fada, are usually pronounced wrong. And other ones not so much. And I already mentioned broad C and G. So this brings me to my next point. My brother asked me, which I've also asked myself before, how are these, what I'm calling mispronunciations, how are they not correct? His question was, if it's Irish people learning the Irish language in Ireland, is that not just the natural way that things go? Is that not just how language evolves? And are these new pronunciations not valid? I asked myself the same question. I used to think it was fine. I used to want it to be fine because I didn't want to have to learn anything new, obviously. But unfortunately, the answer is no. And there's two things that this question depends on. One, which is true for every country and every language, in linguistics, what is correct pronunciation of a language depends on native speakers, right? So if you're a language learner, if you're not a native speaker, that's you have to submit yourself to whatever pronunciations they tell you to make, no matter how hard they are. Like you can't start to learn Spanish and say, oh, the sound r, I don't like that sound, I'm just gonna ignore it. You can't learn German and say, oh, ist, that's too much effort to remember that spelling rule, I'm just gonna pronounce it as isht. You have to put in the effort, and if you do put in the effort, you'll sound so much more genuine. You'll really appreciate the spelling, the uniqueness of the language, and native speakers will understand you better, and you will understand native speakers better, and that gives you so many more sources that you can understand easier, right? So the second thing that this question depends on is the difference between, not languages that aren't endangered and languages that are. Now, Irish might not be dying, and I don't think it will die. I can make a whole video about that myself, but it is endangered, right? Over the last 200 years, the amount of Irish speakers has plummeted, obviously. And so, when you think about it, over the last 200 years, we've lost so many Irish speakers. And also, over the last 200 years, these spelling mistakes, these pronunciation mistakes have started to exist. Only over the last 200 years have, because of the education system, have people in Dublin, and all the counties started to try learn Irish, and then started to ignore native pronunciation and just use their own accent, right? Which I think that is pretty solid evidence that this pronunciation of Irish using your own accent is, because it's so young, it's just not valid, right? Um, what happens then is, like, yes, it is natural for languages to change. It's natural for languages to be influenced by foreign languages. I'm not going to go back 600 years to Munster and point in the face of all the Munster speakers that, like, you know, started to pick up French words like garçon. I'm not going to point at those people and say, hey, you shouldn't be using French words because they're foreign and it's not natural. That was natural, right? But this is language endangerment, right? Completely different story. This is rapid decline in language use, which means it's way more Irish is way more susceptible to having, like, truckloads of influence from English, which, like, Irish already has influence from English in many words, right? And in some dialects in pronunciation. But, like, if we go back literally 50, 60 years, the gap in like the difference in pronunciation between the native speakers and the speakers of schools, the learners in schools, is so wide. If you understand what I'm saying. So that those two things mean, one, so we have to rely on native speakers for no matter what language you're learning, you have to rely on native speakers to tell you how to pronounce things correctly. But two, because it's an endangered language, because there's a rapid decline in care for native pronunciation and using the correct sounds, we also have a duty to look back in the past, literally only 50, 60 years. That's not a long time to look back in the past and realize, okay, these are the mistakes that we've been making over a short amount of time because of the education system, and this is how we reverse them. These are the correct sounds that we've lost, right? Anyway, there we go. So, how can you tell personally if you're making mistakes in your pronunciation of Irish? The easiest way is to compare words, right? Compare Irish words to English words, because naturally, I mean, it sounds silly to say, if you compare an English word to a word that sounds similar to that word in any other language, you will say, okay, that word, like, let's say, oh god, I'm really doing it. Let's say I'm an English speaker. I have the word net, and I go to Russia and I say, oh, do you have any words that sound similar to the word net, as in like a fishing net? The Russians will say, oh yeah, we have this word, niet, niet. And I go, obviously, my reaction is going to be, yes, that's obviously slightly similar, but I'm not an idiot. I can hear that it's not the exact same. If you do that with any English word compared to any other language, you'll have the same reaction. Yeah, I can hear that it's similar, but there's slight differences. So if you can't do that with Irish, then there are improvements to be made. So, massive offender is the word me. Me, me means I, right? M-E father. If you pronounce that exactly like, which side am I on? Like this English word, um, it just doesn't make sense. That means you are using English pronunciation to speak Irish, and in my upcoming videos, I'm going to explain how to pronounce each of these sounds individually properly. Another thing, another like simple. This word, she, means he, and people will often pronounce it like this English word, she, and it's just not the same, unfortunately. So yes, compare words. If your Irish words sound the exact same as English words, then you probably have a bit of work to do. And that brings me to my last point. What can you do? Right? So, most advice that you'll get, right, is just people just say, any teachers in any language, the most advice that you'll get is listen. They'll say, oh, just listen to me make the sound. I'm like, if I struggle to pronounce the sound r in Spanish, and the only help that I'm getting is look at me, look at my mouth, listen to me say it. It's no, you're not doing it right. You have to listen. That's terrible. I'm not getting anywhere. You're not explaining anything to me. So, yes, it's slightly important, right? Listening is part of the process because it allows you to get the fine details, the cherry on top of pronunciation. But really, if you struggle to begin making a sound, you're not going to be able to make it at all just by listening. So the first step is to have a bit of humility, right? To sit down to yourself and admit that you have a lot of work to make, right? That you want to learn proper pronunciation and that you're able to, and that you weren't correct before. Because the biggest mistake to make in pronunciation, like having bad pronunciation in Irish, making mistakes isn't your fault. There is a bad education system. It is an endangered language. There's not as many sources, and there's a trend of you're just doing what you've been taught, right? That's fine. The mistake begins when if you find a source that highlights correct pronunciation, that is using native speech, that's trying to explain to you the real sounds that are present in Irish, the big mistake is to deny, right? Which is what I did for a very long time. You hear these things, you hear people saying, oh no, you're actually pronouncing this wrong, you should do it this way. And you deny, you say, no, actually, that's not normal, that's not how I want to do it. I just want to ignore that, right? That's a mistake. That's down to you, that's your fault. And you can do so much better, right? So that brings me to this book, right? Great book, A Grammar of Modern Irish. I wouldn't recommend it unless you really want to understand everything. It is heavy. This is the simplified version, and this is a real head wrecker to read, right? It exists to really just so everything is written down, this isn't a basics course. This is I am getting every fine detail that has ever existed in this language. So be if I can't, so be it. The first section of this book, now obviously it's a book, it can't speak to me. Using it to learn pronunciation is pretty um, it's only going to get me halfway, but it does have a big section on spelling, and it has a couple, um, you know, tips on pronunciation, right? So if we go to consonants, right, and we go to F and V, right. Now I'm gonna have a whole video about these. You can't see that, but I'm just gonna read out what it says. So consonants, F and V, slender. Draw the lips in, touch them together. Do not let the upper teeth touch the lower lip. Right? When I read that, I was like, what? No way. F and V, but there's so many words that I pronounce. Phone, foil, like mo, vrichte. I say v and f when I'm speaking Irish all the time, and now I've suddenly learned that I have to say f or v and whatever, it's actually meant to be lip to lip. When I heard that, I just denied it. I was just like, no, so many native speakers don't do that anymore. Like, it was too hard. It's actually not really that hard to do, if you just focus. But I didn't want it to be true, and that's what you have to do. You have to have a bit of humility. You have to just admit it, right? Next step is just to take it slow, find good sources. I'm gonna do a whole load of videos explaining in detail how you actually produce sounds with your mouth, right? Like what's actually happening, and slowly you can build up proper pronunciation from that. And yeah, once you understand what is actually happening when you make sounds, which unfortunately you have to do. I mean, if you're not a native speaker of a language and there's a sound in that language which is different from your native language, you have to learn what's happening. You can't just do it simply off of ear. You have to learn what your tongue is doing, what your lips are doing, what your voice box is doing, whatever. And once you do that, then spelling will make a lot more sense. Then bad spelling like this, board, quail, down, gaelga, will make it will make a lot more sense why that is bad. Once you get past that stage, after a week or two, everything comes together and you realize, oh, Irish spelling is actually really consistent. Native Irish speech is actually quite easy. Listening will be easier for you. You can turn on radio na Gaeltachta and you'll start to recognize words more, and then it all unfolds, right? That's my message. And that is basically the psychology behind Irish pronunciation and poor Irish pronunciation, which has been caused by the education system and standard Irish. So, hopefully, when you're watching this, my other videos are out. You can dive straight into learning proper sounds that exist in the language, and good luck. All more. Boom.